I thought my biggest mistake was checking my bank account after my brother's wedding. But the real betrayal wasn't the $8 or $400 they stole. It was how easily they laughed when I confronted them. This isn't just a story about stolen money. It's about what happens when you finally say no to the people who raised you and take them to court, to prove that love without respect is just control. The soft chime of hotel room sunlight filtered in through the curtains as Claire Moore zipped up the last corner of her suitcase. It was the morning after her younger brother Tommy's wedding, a beautiful but emotionally exhausting weekend in Portland. Claire, a 32-year-old financial consultant living in Seattle, had spent the past 2 days smiling politely through family small talk and performing her unspoken role as the dependable one. She had paid for the bridesmaid dresses, covered the hotel rooms for out-of-town guests, and even arranged a rehearsal dinner when her parents forgot. She didn't mind, not entirely. She had a good job, no kids, and lived comfortably. Still, it would have been nice if someone had simply said thank you. Now she and Ethan Grant, her partner of 4 years and a practicing attorney, were preparing to check out and drive back home. Ethan emerged from the bathroom in his usual composed style, tie loose around his neck and hair still damp. Claire smiled at him, grateful for the calm he always brought into her life. "I'll settle the room bill," she said, reaching for her phone and opening her banking app. As the numbers loaded, her breath caught in her throat. The screen stared back at her like a betrayal. Her fingers froze mid-air. "Ethan," she said quietly, voice trembling. He looked up from his suitcase. "What is it?" "My account. It's missing $800. He walked over immediately, concern flickering in his eyes. Claire held up her phone for him to see. "I had over 10 grand in here last weekend. Now there's only 1,600. Ethan took the phone from her gently but firmly and scrolled through the transaction history. His brows furrowed as he scanned the recent activity. "There are 3 transfers here," he said. $2,000 to a credit card under your sister, Melissa's name. $4,000 to an account listed under Greg Washington, that's her husband, right?" Claire nodded numb. "And another $2,400 to your mom's account," he added grimly. "All processed last night. Right around 9 p.m. Claire's mouth opened, then closed again. Her mind was scrambling to make sense of it. "I was in the shower." "Around then," she murmured. Ethan looked at her seriously. "Claire, did you authorize any of these?" "No," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't send anything." A beat of silence passed between them. Ethan's voice turned low and sharp, the tone she'd only ever heard when he was working on a court case. "Someone accessed your phone while you were away from it." Claire felt sick. Her thoughts went back to the hotel room, to the chaos of everyone coming and going. Melissa had stopped by to borrow perfume, and Greg had hung around, fiddling with the TV remote. It wouldn't have been hard to grab her phone while she was in the shower, especially since... Her heart dropped. Her password. It was the same one she'd used for years. Something simple, something predictable, something her family could have guessed. She sat down on the edge of the bed, trembling. Ethan knelt in front of her. "We need to call the bank and report this immediately." "We can't let this slide." Claire shook her head, still stunned. "Why would they do this?" Ethan didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Let's get downstairs and deal with this from there. The sooner we act, the better." Still in a daze, Claire slipped on her shoes and followed Ethan down to the hotel lobby. The Sunday morning bustle of other guests checking out felt like a surreal backdrop to the storm raging in her mind. As they waited for the elevator, Claire's phone buzzed. It was a call from her mom. She hesitated. "Answer it," Ethan said gently. Claire picked up. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," her mother chirped as if nothing were wrong. "I just wanted to thank you for yesterday. Tommy was so happy. It all went beautifully. Don't you think?" Claire steadied her voice. "Mom, I need to ask you something." "Of course," her mom said. "Did you know anything about money being transferred from my bank account last night?" There was a pause. Then her mother laughed, bright, airy, and impossibly casual. "Oh, that," she said. "It was actually less than I expected." Claire felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "Well, Melissa saw your account while helping you with your makeup, and we noticed you had more than enough. We thought, why not help out with the wedding costs a bit? You weren't using it for anything urgent." Claire's mouth went dry. She struggled to breathe. "You split up my money without asking me." Her mom chuckled again. "Come on, Claire, we're family. You always have so much. You're single, no kids, a great job. We just thought—" "That's theft," Claire interrupted, her voice cracking. "Don't be so dramatic," her mom snapped. "You always make everything about you." Ethan leaned over and took the phone. "Hi, this is Ethan Grant, Claire's partner. What you've done is illegal. Unauthorized access to someone's account is a federal offense." "Oh," the lawyer, her mother said, voice cooling. "Stay out of family matters, will you?" Claire reached over and took the phone back. "How did you even get into my account, Melissa?" "Did it," her mom said breezily. She's always been good with that tech stuff. And then, a click. The call ended. Claire stood frozen as the elevator dinged and the doors opened. Ethan reached for her hand. "We'll fix this," he said. She nodded slowly, but her whole world had tilted sideways. The people she loved most had just robbed her while pretending they were entitled to it. And the worst part was, they didn't even think they'd done anything wrong. Claire sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's car, staring blankly out the window as they pulled out of the hotel driveway. Her phone sat silent in her lap, but her thoughts were deafening. Her mother's laughter echoed in her ears. It was actually less than I expected. The nerve, the absolute casualness. Claire had always known her family operated in shades of guilt and expectation. But this was something else. This was stealing. Not symbolic, not emotional, not metaphorical. Real theft. $400 siphoned out of her account while she was in the shower. They didn't even try to hide it. As Ethan drove through the early morning mist, Claire suddenly spoke. "I want to go to my parents' house." Ethan glanced sideways. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "No," Claire said. "But I'm going anyway." 30 minutes later, they pulled into the cul-de-sac where her childhood home still stood. Same faded shutters, same rusted mailbox, same creaking porch swing. Only now it felt more like a crime scene than a memory. Ethan placed a hand gently on her arm. "Just remember what we talked about. Stay calm. Stick to facts." Claire nodded, even though every nerve in her body was buzzing. She rang the doorbell. A moment later, her father opened the door holding a newspaper under one arm and a mug of coffee in the other. "Oh, Claire," he said, surprised. "Thought you two had already left town." "Morning, Dad," she said stiffly. He stepped aside and let them in. Inside the living room, her mother was perched on the couch with Melissa and Greg, all chatting, like it was just another lazy Sunday. But the second Claire stepped in, the room froze. "Claire," her mom said with that same sing-song voice, "come sit down. Did you enjoy the wedding?" Claire didn't sit. She looked directly at her sister. "How did you get into my bank account?" Melissa raised an eyebrow, then shrugged like it was no big deal. "It was easy." "You always use the same password?" Claire clenched her jaw. "Why?" Greg leaned back on the sofa, one arm draped lazily over the cushion. "We needed the money," he said flatly. "And you weren't exactly hurting for it." Claire blinked. "Excuse me. You live alone. No kids making six figures," Melissa chimed in. "Meanwhile, we're trying to raise a family on one income, Harry's piano lessons, Margaret's school trip. It all adds up." "That doesn't give you the right to steal from me," Claire snapped. Her mother stood up, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Claire, honey, don't make this into something it's not. We're family. Family helps each other." Without asking, Claire's voice cracked. "We thought you'd understand," her mom said softly. "It was for Tommy's wedding. A once-in-a-lifetime event. We didn't think you'd mind, I found out, because I was trying to pay the hotel bill. Claire said I was humiliated. And you all sat there acting like nothing happened. Greg chuckled. Come on, Claire. You make it sound like we robbed a bank. You did. Ethan spoke up, stepping forward. Except the account belonged to someone who trusted you. Her mom's eyes narrowed. Oh, the lawyer again. Yes, Ethan said evenly. And as a lawyer, I'm telling you what you did was criminal. Unauthorized access, financial fraud, identity misuse. Stop throwing legal jargon around like you know what's best for our family. Her dad finally spoke, folding his newspaper with a sigh. This is a private matter. No, Claire said, voice now rising. It stopped being private the moment you took money from me without consent. Melissa rolled her eyes. You're blowing this out of proportion. You always act like the victim, her mom added. We've done everything for you. Supported you when you moved to Seattle, who sent you care packages in college. That was 15 years ago, Claire said, stunned. So what? Her mom snapped. We're still family. That never stops meaning something. Claire laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You've used that word like a weapon my whole life. Ethan placed a hand gently on her back, grounding her. Claire looked around the room. These were the people she had celebrated birthdays with, shared holidays with. She had driven 6 hours last year when Greg had back surgery, taken time off work to babysit her nieces. Wired money when Melissa's car broke down and they had stolen from her while she was naked in a hotel bathroom. I want my money back, she said, voice cold and clear. Greg shrugged. It's gone. We used it, Melissa added. It was a gift for Tommy and some bills. And shopping. Claire stared at her. Shopping. Greg grinned. The same smartwatch you were flaunting. I've got the same one now. Looks good, huh? Claire's vision blurred. Her mother stepped forward again, tone shifting to concern. Claire, don't let some outsider poison you against your own blood. She's not being poisoned, Ethan said. She's finally seeing the truth. Claire's father tossed the newspaper aside and stood. You know what? Maybe you should go. Cool off. We'll talk later. There won't be a later, Claire said. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door, Ethan right behind her. And as she reached the front steps, Melissa called after her. Don't be so mad. With your income, you'll make it back in no time. Claire paused, then turned around slowly. You didn't just take my money, she said. You broke something you'll never get back. She stepped into the car. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. Inside, Ethan started the engine. Claire stared out the window again, the same window from which she'd once waved goodbye to her parents every time she returned to college. Except now she wasn't going away. She was leaving, and this time for good. The drive back to Seattle was quiet. Claire kept her gaze fixed on the highway ahead, but her thoughts weren't in the car. They were scattered across years, birthdays, emergencies, little favors that never felt so little in hindsight. I feel like I've been asleep for a decade, she finally said. Ethan glanced over, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near hers. You weren't asleep. You were trained to believe that love meant self-sacrifice. Claire let out a breath. Do you remember when I bought Harry that gaming console? Ethan nodded. Melissa texted me a wish list for his 10th birthday. The cheapest thing on it was over $300. I told her I couldn't afford that on short notice, and she sent back a one-line reply, Wow, I didn't know my sister was this selfish. Ethan's jaw tightened. Claire continued. I bought the console overnight shipping. Hand wrote a card. She posted a picture thanking a dear family friend, never mentioned my name. Ethan shook his head but said nothing. Claire leaned back into the seat. Or the time Greg's car broke down. I was between jobs, barely making rent, but they called me crying about how they couldn't get to work or pick up the kids. So I wired them $200. Then 2 weeks later, I saw them on Facebook at a weekend resort. She let that hang in the air. I told Mom I was hurt. You know what, she said, they needed a break. Don't be petty, Claire. There was silence again, not the comfortable kind, the kind that comes when realization scrapes against memory layer by painful layer. And let's not forget, she added bitterly, the new water heater I paid for when theirs broke, or the entire fence replacement I covered after Dad said they'd pay me back next paycheck. That was 4 years ago. Ethan exhaled. It's like they built a financial safety net out of your generosity. Claire laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. No, not generosity, obligation. They made sure I never saw it any other way. She looked out at the passing trees. They always said it with a smile, too. Claire's the responsible one, Claire always comes through. And when I didn't, when I hesitated even a little, I became difficult, dramatic. Ethan pulled off onto a rest stop. He parked, turned toward her, and took her hand. Can I tell you something? He asked. Claire nodded. They're not angry because you changed. They're angry because you stopped being easy to exploit. Claire blinked. They lost their emotional leverage, Ethan continued. The guilt they've used like a leash for years, you finally unclipped it. And now they're panicking because if they can't guilt you, they can't control you. Claire swallowed. Her eyes were stinging, but she wouldn't cry. Not here, not again. I always thought love was supposed to be messy, she whispered. A little selfless, a little uncomfortable. It is, Ethan said gently, but love doesn't demand silence or obedience or your bank account. Claire chuckled softly. That should go on a t-shirt. They sat in silence for a few moments, the air between them filling with something heavier than anger. Recognition. Mourning. Why didn't I see it sooner? She asked quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. Because you loved them, and when you love someone, you give them the benefit of the doubt. Again and again, until one day you realize you've run out of reasons to excuse the pain they've caused. Claire stared out the windshield, eyes glassy. It's not just about the money, it's about the way they looked at me. Like I owed them something for daring to be okay. You don't, Ethan said. You never did. She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time since the whole nightmare began, Claire felt a strange, cautious sense of relief. Because now she understood something that had been hiding in plain sight her whole life. Love, real love, doesn't chain you to guilt. It doesn't call you selfish for choosing peace. It doesn't punish you for saying no. And family should never make you feel used. The following morning, Claire sat at the kitchen table in silence, her laptop open in front of her. A blank spreadsheet stared back at her like a mirror. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but she couldn't bring herself to type. Ethan poured her a cup of coffee and placed it beside her. You haven't said much since yesterday. Claire nodded slowly. I'm thinking about... She took a breath. If I report them, it'll tear the family apart. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed quiet. For a moment, Claire, they already did that when they stole from you. Claire looked up, eyes tired. But people will talk. I'll be the villain, the daughter who turned her parents in, the sister who couldn't forgive. And what does that make them, Ethan? Asked heroes. She looked away. I know how this looks, she whispered. I know it sounds clean-cut, but they're still my family. Ethan, I grew up with them. We've shared Thanksgivings, birthdays, backyard barbecues. If I take legal action, it won't just be a lawsuit, it'll be a funeral. Ethan walked over and sat across from her. Do you want me to make an appointment with someone who can walk you through your options? No pressure. Just information. Claire hesitated, then nodded. That afternoon, Claire and Ethan sat in a quiet office lined with shelves of legal books. Across from them was Olivia Chen, a composed and clear-eyed attorney who specialized in financial crimes, particularly those within families. I've read through the summary. Ethan sent me. Olivia began, her voice calm but direct. Claire, I need to tell you this up front. What your family did constitutes multiple criminal acts, unauthorized access fraud, and potentially coercion depending on prior interactions. Claire winced. But they're my parents, my sister. I don't want them to go to jail. Olivia nodded, not unkindly. That's a natural response. But understand the law doesn't include a clause that says, unless they're family. Theft is theft. Emotional manipulation doesn't erase the crime. Claire said nothing. Olivia continued. If you stole $400 from a coworker's account, there would be no debate about whether consequences were appropriate. So why should it be any different? Just because you share DNA. Ethan reached over and gently squeezed Claire's hand. I'm not trying to pressure you, Olivia added, but I do want you to see this situation clearly and what it may mean for you long term. If it continues, Claire nodded slowly. I think I need to understand how deep this goes. That night, Claire sat alone with a pile of bank statements, Venmo transfers, text threads, and handwritten notes she had saved over the years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she began organizing them into folders. One document at a time, she uncovered the truth she'd been too afraid to face. $1,200 for Greg's car repair, $3,000 to cover her parents' overdue property tax, $850 for Melissa's dental surgery when her insurance didn't cover enough, $400 loaned for a niece's school fundraiser never acknowledged, $200 for a family emergency that was later revealed to be a vacation to Palm Springs. Claire sat back staring at the growing total $15,340 in 2 years all gone, none of it formally requested. Most of it emotionally coerced, and somehow not once had anyone said thank you. Instead, she'd been met with, "You're the only one doing well. You don't have kids. It's easier for you. If you cared about us, you wouldn't even ask questions." Claire felt the weight of every guilt trip sink into her chest. Was this love? Or was it something they'd dressed up as love, a performance that only worked as long as she kept paying the price? She closed her laptop and looked over at Ethan, who had been sitting quietly across the room. "Do you think I'm overreacting?" she asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "No. I think you've been underreacting for a very long time." Claire looked down at her hands. "If I go through with this, there's no going back." "There wasn't any going back the moment they laughed while telling you your money was already gone," he replied gently. "You didn't choose this." "They did?" Claire closed her eyes. In that moment, something inside her shifted, not a hardening, but a realignment. This wasn't about revenge. This was about recovery. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Then let's do it. I'll report it." Ethan nodded once. "Okay. I'm with you, every step of the way." And for the first time in days, Claire felt something close to peace, the kind that only comes when you finally stop betraying yourself to protect people who never protected you. Claire stood in front of the tall glass doors of the Financial Crimes Division with a folder tucked tightly under her arm. The morning light reflected off the building's clean surfaces, but inside her chest felt like it was full of storm clouds. Ethan stood beside her. "Are you ready?" She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "Let's go." The officer assigned to her case was Detective Taylor, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the steady tone of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't grown numb to it. "Ms. Moore," she said after shaking Claire's hand. "Please tell me everything." Claire took a shaky breath and began. She told her everything, the $400, the breach of her phone while she was in the shower, the history of manipulation, and the calculated belief that she wouldn't say anything because they were family. Ethan helped clarify legal terms, and finally Claire placed her evidence on the desk bank records, screenshots, transfers, even text messages from her family referring to her money as if it were community property. Detective Taylor reviewed everything carefully, then looked up. "This is clear financial exploitation and unauthorized access. We'll begin a preliminary investigation. It's possible that criminal charges will follow, and yes, that includes your parents." Claire swallowed hard. "I understand," she said. but nothing could have prepared her for what would happen next. The fallout began 48 hours later. Her phone lit up with a barrage of texts. "Mom, Claire, what have you done? The police just came to the house. What will the neighbors think? You've brought shame to this family. Melissa, please, I can't sleep. Harry's school is asking questions. I'm begging you. Don't do this. We're your family. Dad, you want to put your own parents in court. I didn't raise a daughter like this." Claire didn't respond. Later that night, the phone rang. This time she answered Claire. Her mother's voice was low, trembling with rage and disbelief. "You've destroyed this family." "No." "Mom," Claire replied evenly, "I just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. You always think you're better than us." "No," Claire said. "I think I deserve to be treated with respect. And apparently that was too much to ask for." Her mother let out a bitter laugh. "What's next? You'll drag your own mother into court. You already did that. The moment you told Melissa to go into my phone and take my money." Then came her father's voice in the background, hard and cold. "You're no longer our daughter. Don't ever come back to this house." The line went dead. Claire stared at the phone in her hand, heart pounding, but not from fear. From release. It was over. The illusion was shattered. The web of guilt, obligation, and silent self-sacrifice. She had lived in her whole life, had finally collapsed. She didn't cry. Instead, she sat down on the couch and let the stillness wash over her. Ethan returned home later that evening. He found Claire curled up on the couch with a blanket over her legs and her hands resting in her lap. He walked over and gently lifted her chin. "You okay?" he asked. She gave a small, tired smile. "They disowned me." Ethan didn't look surprised. "I'm sorry I'm not," she said. "Not anymore." She stood and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. "They made their choice," she said softly. "And for the first time, I made mine." Ethan leaned against the counter. "Claire, you didn't destroy your family. You defended yourself. They're angry because the one person they thought would never stand up finally did." He stepped closer. "You drew a line," he said. "And that's not betrayal. That's survival." Claire looked at him, eyes steadier now. "I keep thinking of all the times I stayed quiet because I didn't want to cause a scene. Or all the times I gave in because I didn't want to be called selfish." "You weren't selfish," Ethan said. "You were scared. And now you're brave." Claire looked down at her hands, the same hands that had signed birthday checks, fixed broken fences, and wired emergency funds in the middle of the night. Now they were doing something different. They were finally protecting her. That night, Claire opened her journal for the first time in weeks. She wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. "Saying no doesn't make me the villain." Then she closed the book and went to bed, not in pieces, but whole. For the first time in her life, she had chosen herself, and it felt like peace. The lake shimmered beneath the soft amber hue of the setting sun. Claire stood at the edge of the dock, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, the steam curling gently into the early evening air. Across the still water, pine trees swayed in a quiet rhythm. For a moment, the world didn't feel like it was collapsing or rebuilding, just pausing. Ethan walked up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Beautiful out here, isn't it?" Claire smiled. "It's perfect." They had driven 2 hours north of Seattle to the lake house Ethan's parents sometimes used for weekend getaways. When he'd suggested a short trip to breathe, Claire hadn't argued. The air here was different, clean, crisp, untouched by conflict. They had first visited this place a year ago during a long conversation about starting a family someday. Back then, Claire had imagined bringing her children here to swim kayak toast marshmallows. She'd envisioned a future rooted in warmth. Now that dream didn't feel so distant. It felt real. As twilight deepened, Ethan gently took her hand. "Come with me." They walked together down the dock where a small table was set with flickering candles, a simple dinner and a bouquet of wildflowers. Claire blinked. "What is this?" Ethan gave a small smile. A new chapter. They shared a quiet meal and talked about everything but the past week, the way people sometimes do when they both know healing is already happening wordlessly. When the plates were cleared and the stars began peeking through the sky, Ethan stood up slowly. Claire watched him curiously. Then he dropped to one knee. Her heart froze. He pulled out a small, simple velvet box. No flash, no extravagance, just him. Steady, kind, and sure. Claire. He began, the last few weeks have shown me just how strong you really are, not just because you stood up for yourself, but because you never stopped loving, even when others failed to love you back. Claire's breath hitched. I don't want to build a life with someone who's always pleasing everyone else. Ethan said, I want to build it with the version of you who chooses herself, who draws the line, who knows what she deserves. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a single stone, modest, elegant, intentional. I want us to have a family, Claire. One that's built on trust, on laughter, on respect, not guilt or silence. A family where you never have to lose yourself to be loved. His voice softened. Because real family is a place you never have to sacrifice yourself just to belong. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She wasn't crying because she was afraid or overwhelmed. She was crying because something inside her, something old and bruised and worn out, was finally breaking in the best way. She dropped to her knees in front of him and whispered, Yes. They held each other for a long time, the lake silent except for the rustle of wind through the trees. The stars reflected off the water like promises. Later that night, as they sat on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket, Claire looked up and said, You know what I realized today? What I didn't lose? A family, she said softly. I just stopped calling dysfunction by that name. I'm not leaving something behind. I'm starting something new, something real. Ethan kissed the top of her head. With someone who sees you. She smiled. With someone who never asked me to disappear in order to be loved. And in that quiet moment, with no voices telling her who she was supposed to be, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years. Home a week after the proposal, Claire sat at her kitchen table sipping tea and flipping through the day's mail. Most of it was junk coupons, catalogs, the occasional wedding venue brochure sent by some auto-generated mailing list. Then she saw it. A soft, cream-colored envelope with no return address. Her name was written in a careful hand. Claire Moore. No title, no formality. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a small pressed flower tucked neatly into the crease. Dear Claire, you don't know me. My name is Samantha. I saw an article last week about your case. It didn't name you directly, but I knew it was you. I recognized your story because it felt like mine. I've spent most of my adult life saying yes to my family out of fear. Fear that they'd call me ungrateful. Fear that I'd be alone. Fear that I was being selfish for keeping what I earned. My mother took out credit cards in my name without asking. My brother asked for help with one-time bills that turned into years of dependency. And when I finally said no, last year they told me I was cold, that I would die alone, that I was heartless. But when I read about you, Claire, something cracked open inside me. You gave a name to what I'd been feeling for so long but couldn't explain: financial abuse. You made me realize I have the right to protect myself, that boundaries aren't a betrayal. They're a form of love for myself. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for showing us that we're not bad daughters or bad sisters or bad people, just because we refuse to be taken advantage of. You gave me permission to say no, and for the first time in years, I finally did. With love, Samantha Davis. Claire read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She traced the flower between her fingers, a small, dried sprig of lavender, and felt her chest tighten. Not with sadness this time, but with something warm, something like awe. Samantha's words echoed louder than any courtroom judgment, louder than her parents' accusations, louder than the guilt that had threatened to strangle her just weeks ago. You gave me permission to say no. Claire leaned back and let the silence of the kitchen settle around her. For so long she had believed that her suffering was a solitary burden, a shameful crack in an otherwise picture-perfect life. But now she saw it differently. Her story was a mirror. And in sharing it, she had given others the courage to look into their own. Later that day, Ethan came home to find her still at the table, the letter open in front of her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Claire nodded. "I got a letter today. From a woman named Samantha." She handed it to him and he read it slowly. When he finished, he looked up, his expression tender. "That's powerful." Claire exhaled. "I thought speaking up would isolate me. But it's done the opposite. I'm connecting with people I've never met. People who've carried the same silence." Ethan pulled up a chair beside her. "That's the thing about truth. When you say it out loud, it becomes a lighthouse." Claire smiled faintly. "You think I'm a lighthouse? I think you've been through a storm," he said, "and you didn't let it drown you. Now you're lighting the way for others." She rested her head on his shoulder. The next morning, she posted a short message to a women's financial resilience forum under her real name, something she hadn't dared do before. It read, "I used to think protecting myself meant I was turning my back on love. Now I know real love doesn't require silence, guilt, or sacrifice. If you're struggling to set boundaries with your family, you're not alone, and you're not selfish. You're allowed to say no." Sometimes healing starts with one hard truth, and sometimes that truth sets others free too. Within hours, her inbox filled with messages, not of pity, but of recognition. Women and men shared stories of quietly drained accounts, inherited debt, siblings who manipulated under the guise of need, parents who rewrote guilt into obligation. And again the same line appeared. "Thank you for speaking." Claire turned off her screen and sat in the quiet hum of her apartment, letting the magnitude of it all sink in. Her fight had never been just about money. It was about reclaiming her voice, and somehow in doing so, she had helped others find theirs too. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paperwork. A scent Claire hadn't noticed before but now associated with reckoning. She sat at the front, flanked by Ethan on one side and her attorney, Olivia Chen, on the other. Her palms rested on her lap. Steady now, steadier than she had expected, Melissa and Greg sat across the aisle, their lawyer whispering urgently to them. Neither of them meeting Claire's eyes. Her parents weren't present. Whether that was out of shame, spite, or strategy, she didn't know. What she did know was that this day had come not because she wanted revenge, but because silence had cost her enough. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. As the proceedings began, Olivia presented the case in calm, composed terms. Unauthorized access, financial coercion, repeated patterns of exploitation. Claire's evidence was airtight. The transactions, the messages, the motive. But what no one expected, not even Claire, was the next witness Olivia called to the stand. "Your Honor." "Olivia said we'd like to call Mr. Thomas Moore." Claire blinked. Tommy heads turned as her younger brother rose slowly from the back of the courtroom. Claire hadn't seen him since she filed the report. He had texted once, weeks ago, saying he needed time. She never responded. Now he walked forward with nervous steps and stood before the court. The judge asked for his oath. Tommy's voice was shaky but clear as he swore to tell the truth. "Mr. Moore," Olivia began gently, "can you tell us what you know about the events surrounding the unauthorized transactions made from your sister Claire's bank account?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't know the exact amounts," he began, "but I knew Melissa and Greg were planning something." Claire inhaled sharply. "I overheard them talking about how Claire wouldn't notice a few thousand, and how she always came through when it counted. They were laughing. I should have said something, but I didn't." His voice cracked. "I didn't want to ruin the wedding. I thought it was just talk. And when did you realize it wasn't?" Olivia asked. "The night after the wedding, Claire told me what happened. That's when I knew they'd followed through." Olivia paused. "Why did you choose to testify today?" Tommy looked at Claire, eyes full of something she couldn't immediately name. "Guilt, fear, but also resolve, because I couldn't keep pretending anymore." He said Claire was the only one who ever showed up for this family. Birthdays, bills, emergencies, and we used her. We all did, and when she finally stood up for herself, we turned on her. Claire felt her throat tighten. "I'm not proud of what I did," Tommy continued, "or rather, what I didn't do. But I'm here now, and I want the court to know the truth. Claire didn't destroy our family. We did that ourselves." There was a long silence in the courtroom as his words settled over the room like a weight no one could ignore. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Moore. You may step down." Claire watched as Tommy walked past her. He paused beside her seat, leaned in, and whispered, "I'm sorry." She nodded slowly, too full to speak. The judge returned a verdict by late afternoon. Melissa and Greg were sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to repay the full $8,400, plus an additional $5,000 in damages for emotional distress. A restraining order was issued. No contact with Claire. No proximity within 500 feet. No indirect communication. Claire sat still as the sentence was read aloud. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like breathing again for the first time. Outside the courtroom, Claire and Ethan stepped into the fading light of a crisp autumn day. Tommy was waiting near the steps, hands shoved awkwardly into his coat pockets. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. Claire nodded. "I know I should have come forward sooner," he said. "I was scared. I kept thinking if I said something, I'd lose them." "You probably will," Claire said quietly. Tommy gave a sad smile. "I already did. But if staying silent means becoming like them, then I don't want that kind of family." Claire looked at him. "What you did today mattered. Not just for me, for you too." He nodded. "I don't know what comes next, but I want to do better." Claire placed a hand on his arm. "Then start there." As Ethan returned with the car, Tommy stepped back. "Thank you for not giving up on what was right, Claire." "Even when I did?" She gave him a small smile. Telling the truth always costs something, but sometimes it gives back more than we expected. And in that moment, Claire realized justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly in the voice of someone finally brave enough to break the silence. The trial was over, but the consequences rippled outward like cracks in glass. Claire sat at her desk one quiet morning, skimming headlines over coffee when a name caught her eye. Greg Washington. The company's website had removed him from the executive team page. Ethan confirmed it later that day. HR terminated him, he said gently. His conviction disqualified him from continuing his role. Claire nodded without speaking. A week later, she overheard someone at the grocery store mention a foreclosure notice posted on a home near her parents' street. That night, a mutual friend messaged her privately. Melissa had been let go from her job, citing reputational concerns. The house, her parents' house, was in financial peril. Claire read the message twice and sat back in her chair. The silence suddenly heavy. For a fleeting second, guilt flickered, not the kind she used to feel, the kind that manipulated, cornered, and shamed her into submission, but the soft kind, the deeply human ache that comes from watching people fall even when they built the scaffold themselves. She sat with it, didn't run from it, didn't bury it, just let it be. Ethan came home later that evening and found her standing by the window, arms crossed. "They're losing everything," she said softly. He didn't ask who he already knew. For a moment he said nothing. Then he walked to her side and rested his hand on her back. "Claire, their downfall isn't your doing. It's the result of their choices." She looked at him. "But it started with me." "No," he said firmly. "It started the moment they believed your silence was permanent. All you did was speak." Claire turned her eyes back to the street outside. The world kept turning. Leaves rustled. Life didn't pause for pain. It only demanded we carry it better. You once told me, Ethan continued, that you gave and gave because you thought love was earned. But loving yourself means knowing when to stop bleeding for people who refuse to stop cutting. Claire closed her eyes, his words wrapping around her like quiet armor. That night she opened her laptop and began to write. She titled the post, "I chose to love myself over blind loyalty." For years, I believed that family came first, even when it meant I came last. I was taught that sacrifice was love and silence was noble. I was taught that setting boundaries meant betrayal. But I've learned something. Love without respect is control, and loyalty without truth is bondage. When I reported the people who took from me, I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was trying to save myself. I wasn't angry. I was drowning. And I realized if I didn't speak, I'd be teaching the next generation that abuse wrapped in tradition is still tradition worth keeping. I didn't choose this pain, but I choose what comes next, and I choose me. So to anyone out there afraid to draw the line, afraid you'll be called cold, cruel, selfish, know this. You are not cruel for protecting your peace. You are not selfish for valuing your voice. You are not heartless for walking away from those who taught you to question your worth. You are healing, and you are allowed to let go. She hit publish. The post went live. Within hours, it began to circulate across blogs and forums, bookmarked by readers who had longed to say the same but hadn't found the words. Claire didn't read the comments. She didn't need validation. Writing the truth had been enough. She sat back, closed her laptop, and stepped outside. The evening air smelled like earth and new beginnings. No applause, no fireworks, just stillness. Freedom didn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it was quiet, heavy with clarity. She had let go. Not of anger, not even of the people, but of the debt. The unspoken belief that she owed love, forgiveness, or silence. Simply because someone shared her blood. Claire smiled to herself. She didn't hate them, she just didn't belong to them anymore. The air was filled with the scent of roasted garlic laughter and the warmth of something Claire hadn't felt in a long time belonging. It was a Saturday evening in late spring, and Claire stood in the kitchen of Ethan's parents' home, helping his mother arrange a platter of appetizers. Outside the backyard glowed with soft string lights, a small crowd mingling on the patio for what Ethan had called a quiet family dinner, just us and the people who matter. Claire had hesitated when he suggested it. Family gatherings had become a raw subject, too tangled in memory. But this felt different. Here no one expected her to prove her worth. No one pulled her aside to whisper about money or loyalty. No one eyed her wallet when she walked into the room. Instead, they asked how she was feeling, told her they were proud of her, called her brave Ethan's mother. Estella handed her a dish towel and smiled warmly. "You handled everything with more grace than most people ever could." Claire offered a quiet smile. "I didn't always feel graceful." Estella placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Grace isn't about looking calm, it's about staying rooted even in the storm." Then she leaned in and pulled Claire into a hug. "Welcome to the family." "Sweetheart," she whispered, "we're lucky to have you." Claire blinked back tears. It wasn't the words that broke her. It was the ease with which they were given. No guilt, no conditions. Just love. Later that night, as twilight wrapped the evening in gold, Claire stepped out onto the porch with a glass of wine. She took a deep breath, letting it settle into her chest like a homecoming. The screen door creaked behind her. She turned to see Tommy. He looked different now. Lighter somehow. The way people look when they've put something heavy down. "I brought dessert," he said, holding up a box of pastries from her favorite Seattle bakery. Claire raised an eyebrow. "A bribe." "A peace offering." She laughed. "You didn't need to. You already gave me something better." Tommy leaned against the railing beside her. "I've been interviewing with a few nonprofits in the city. Youth development stuff. I want to do something that, you know, Feels honest. Claire smiled. I think that's a perfect start. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Tommy added, Thank you for not shutting me out. I know I was part of the problem. You weren't the problem, she said. You were part of the silence. And now you're not. Tommy nodded slowly. I don't know if Mom and Dad will ever change. They might not, Claire said. But you did. And that matters. He smiled. I'll keep trying. I know you will. The next morning, Claire checked her email while sipping coffee. Amid promotional clutter and work reminders, one message stood out. Subject, thank you again. From Samantha Davis. Claire opened it. Dear Claire, you probably don't remember me, but I wrote you a letter after I read about your case. I just wanted you to know. I finally moved out of my parents' house. I set boundaries with my brother. I opened my own savings account. My first one ever. It hasn't been easy, but I feel like I'm breathing for the first time in years. You didn't just change your life, you helped change mine. With deep gratitude. Samantha. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, then quietly closed her laptop. She stepped outside into the early morning light barefoot on cool grass and reached for her journal. She opened to the last blank page and with a slow and steady hand wrote, Family isn't where I was born. Family is where I'm loved. Family is where I'm chosen. And most of all, family is where I'm safe. She closed the journal and exhaled the kind of breath that carries something old and heavy away with it. The storm was over. And finally, she had come home.